Let me introduce myself. I am Meena Panikar, who teaches in the Faculty of Law, University of Delhi. I have been working on this module, the role of judiciary in democratic societies. Now, the purpose of this developing this module is basically to see the role judiciary plays in societies like that of India and many other countries where democracy prevails. The objectives for which this module is written is essentially to look at the linkage in between judicial process and stability of democratic societies. It also wants to look at whether the judiciary has played a proactive role in ensuring democracy in the system of governance of the country, and it also tries to look at whether there were any lapses on the part of judiciary when there was really a need of intervention by the judiciary to see that the democracy is not at stake. Now, the whole of the module has been divided into broadly three areas. One is looking at the advantages of having a democratic society in order to ensure justice to the people living in those societies, and secondly, to see to what extent a judicial intervention is possible to ensure democracy in those societies. And whenever the questions of democracy have been raised or the threat to democracy has happened, what role has exactly been performed by the judiciary? And finally, to take one through a number of cases where issues which have relation to democracy have cropped up before the court and how the courts have looked at those issues. This is particularly in the context of India. Let me look at the first point, that is whether we need to have democratic societies in the first place, or in other words, why do we insist on having democratic societies? This is not to suggest that a democratic form of government is the best form of government in terms of ensuring rights to people, but there are certain inherent advantages in a democratic society, and the inherent advantages are closely interrelated. For instance, one of the advantages, if one looks at the democratic societies around the world, is that democratic societies ensure stability and accountability in governance to a large extent. It ensures stability is proved by the democratic societies governments which are run across the world in many countries, or else wherever instability is occurring, you can see the absence of a democratic form of government in those societies and the consequent lack of accountability on the part of people who govern those regimes. The second important aspect as far as democratic society is concerned is that it, to a large extent, it ensures justice to the people of the country where those forms of government exist. Justice is the concept is a very wide notion. What exactly is communicated through that expression could vary from person to person and from place to place, but to a large extent at a broader level, justice denotes fairness, it ensures rights to people, it ensures one's own dignity and equality. The third important aspect when one discusses about democratic societies is that it establishes a rule of law based system where the actions are taken in accordance with the concept of rule of law. Now, what exactly is rule of law is again needed to be discussed further to see that rule of law is essentially not a rule in accordance with the laws. It is more to speak about a spirit in accordance with which the limitations are set on those who govern. Now, Another important aspect with respect to a democratic society is that it guarantees and protects civil liberties of the people. This is more important because that ensures dignity of the individual, and in today's century the dignity of the individual matters a lot. It has been substantially developed, and no system or no country in the world today can afford to say that it would like to compromise on civil liberties of people for the sake of governance. So, all in all, there are certain important milestones being ensured by the democratic societies in terms of stability and accountability, in terms of providing justice, in terms of providing a rule of law based administration, and as a guarantor of civil liberties. When one comes across the literature on democracy, one also will come across the various terminologies which have been used in the context of democracy. Broadly, it has been spoken about for a long time as representative democracy, where the institutions are set up for governance, which are represented by the representatives elected by the people of those societies. So, representative democracy is much more somewhat formal, in sense that it creates institutions wherein the representatives of the people will take decision, and to a large extent satisfies the basic definition of democracy as the rule by the people. But that kind of a formal democracy is to be substantiated by what is called substantive democracy, wherein one ensures that the democratic pattern emerged from those societies also would be adhering to the norms of human rights. And because of the substantial development of human rights jurisprudence in the 21st century, one can see that any democracy which is lacking in terms of compliance with human rights standards accepted widely internationally would be falling short of the definition of democracy, and for that matter a formal democracy needs to be complemented with a substantive democracy aspect. And at times one comes across the words like defensive democracy or militant democracy, wherein these are the attempts to defend the rights of people, or at times even to see that the state becomes extremely active in terms of militantly protecting the democratic spirits, which could also be taking a task on the terrorist aspects. Now, the core elements of a democratic society, it needs to be looked upon a bit in detail in order to see how judiciary is actually becoming the upholder of democracy. One of the very tenets of democratic societies is it ensures free speech and expression. There is a free thought process which is available to the people, and they could express their views either through communication or by supply of information or through various artistic forms of expression. All these are ensured. For instance, if one looks at the Constitution of India through Article 19(1)(a). Now, it is not to suggest that one can have a freedom in absolute terms, suggesting that you could go on having hate speech or spreading communal hatred, for instance. For that reason, that freedom comes with a restriction clause provided in Article 19 clause 2 of the Constitution. So, wherever the free speech has been provided in democratic societies, it is not to suggest that the speech could be taken for granted and one could speak in any way disturbing the similar rights which are available to others. The second important aspect of a democratic society is that a democracy becomes incomplete if there is no access to information, and because that inevitably would be having an adverse effect on the concept of justice. In India, to a large extent, this has been provided through Article 19(1)(a) and also through a legislative effort under the Right to Information Act. Because a democracy functions based on informed choices, an ideal concept of a democracy is incomplete without having due information and the choices of representation being made by people on the basis of that available information. So, to a large extent people should be entitled to get all kinds of information, including the information which could be a negative a critique of the administration, which could be all informations concerning how political parties function, etc., so that the people would be able to make a clear choice for themselves. It also implies that the people need to be educated about, because the information is supplied by one group, and who are at the receiving end, who receive all this information, whether they are having sufficient awareness and education to understand the consequences of that kind of an information. The third important aspect is the democratic society is founded upon a rule of law system. Wherever the rule of law has been compromised, it led to the collapse of the democratic institutions and consequently the very notion of a stable government. In countries around the world where those kind of failed states happen or collapses happen, one could see that the spirit of rule of law was lacking in those societies. Another important element involved in the democratic society's discussion is the freedom which is available not only in terms of speech and a set of other rights, but also to practice one's own religion, and in that context it is worth looking at the minority rights. As far as India is concerned, we are focusing on two kinds of minorities, the linguistic and religious minorities. So, minorities are not necessarily to be confined to those who are having practicing certain religious beliefs, but also consist of linguistic minorities. Now, minority rights are important to be safeguarded in a democratic society, because democracy is by and large governance through a majority rule, and the majority rule, it is the duty on the part of the majority to see that the minority rights are adequately safeguarded. The examples around the world and the history of the world shows that wherever minority rights were not adequately safeguarded, that resulted in mass violations of human rights and subsequent threat to the very existence of democracy itself. An important element in the democratic societies or forms of governance is conducting elections in a free and fair way. It is impliedly there within the Indian constitution, because the formal democracy could be in place when people are able to elect their representatives through free and fair elections. To what extent the free and fair elections could happen from time to time depends upon the quality of governance which is there in the country concerned. Now, come to the, so one after having looked at the democratic societies and the need and the core elements of the democratic societies, we look at the role of judiciary. Now, judiciary has an important role to perform in a democracy, to suggest that it is the upholder of the constitution and democracy. Why we insist on a constitution is that it would be easy to look at a society having a written constitution guaranteeing a democratic form of government as sufficiently facilitating the judiciary to perform its crucial role, guaranteeing that democratic form of governance. When the cases or the disputes come before the court, it could decide accordingly. So, a written constitution has an advantage to see that democracy could be better protected through a judicial intervention many a time. The judiciary also has a role to perform in terms of a review of the executive and the legislative actions. Now, this some point out as an outcome of what happened after the Second World War and during the Holocaust in Germany. Many of the executive actions or the legislative actions need to be contested, and this contestation would take place ideally before the court. So, the court should retain the power of judicial review, which should be part of the inherent power of the court to see that the executive, the other organs of the government are acting within the limits conferred on them by the Constitution. Another area where the judiciary performs a crucial role of working out a democracy in practice is by ensuring civil liberties to the people. There are any number of liberties which are guaranteed to the people if one looks at part 3 of the Constitution, and any reading of part 3 is incomplete without a reference to part 4, which is, though non-enforceable, ensures a set of socio-economic rights. But civil liberties, therefore the meaningful realization of civil liberties is possible only by a combined reading of part 3 and part 4 of the Indian Constitution. And the court performs a very effective role in upholding the civil liberties, and it is the role which is expected of the court to perform as per the constitutional scheme. And connected to that is the court's role in ensuring minority rights. As I said before, a democracy has a crucial role to play in upholding or protecting the minority rights, because democracy is the rule by the majority, and what constitutes that majority could be guided by a number of factors. Now, whether the judiciary would be able to perform these many roles which are expected of it depends upon the constitutional scheme of the country, wherein the place has been accorded to the judiciary accordingly. Things are easier if there is a written constitution which ensures independence of judiciary. Judiciary is able to perform effectively, impartially when it is ensured of independence, its own independence in terms of security of tenure, in terms of the modes which are followed in the appointment process, in terms of the accountability which is expected of the judges. So, the judiciary will perform a pivotal role in a democracy, upholding the democratic pattern of that society, provided there is independence of judiciary. The appointment of judges are done on a much more fairer basis, and the judges themselves are conscious about the accountability they owe to the society. There are any number of cases where the Supreme Court of India had the ample opportunity to discuss about the value of democracy, and one can rate it either on a chronological way or by looking at the decisions as such, the core impact of the judicial decisions. One of the classic decisions where democracy was found to be a basic feature of the Constitution was in Keshavananda Bharati case, Keshavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala in 1973. By laying down the basic structure doctrine, the court actually tried to put limit on the constitutional amendments which could be made by the parliament. So, as per the constitutional scheme, the amendment of the Constitution is a task vested with the parliament, but then can the parliament have an unlimited power of seeing that the Constitution is sufficiently amended to suit the needs of those who govern the society? To put a bar on that kind of unchecked exercise of constitutional amendment power has been done by proposing the basic structure doctrine in Keshavananda Bharati. What the court did was, the court did not actually have a test to see how the basic structure could be found out, but broadly it gave an exhaustive list of features of the Constitution without which the Constitution will lose its spirit. So, once the essence of Constitution is taken out because of a constitutional amendment power exercised by the parliament, then the very existence of the Constitution would be under threat. That is why the court recognized the implied limitations which are there within the Constitution, as been propounded in the Keshavanta Bharati case. Now, what it suggests therefore is that the idea of state needs to be kept alive, and to that extent the basic features of the constitution cannot be altered. The court, having laid down the basic structure doctrine, had made important contribution to the development of constitutionalism and democracy in this country. There were a number of cases where free and fair elections were contested. One of the prominent cases is of 1975, Indira Gandhi's case, election case. After her election was set aside by the High Court, the Supreme Court had an opportunity to see in the election case as to whether the constitutional amendments and the respective changes in the law could amount to a threat to democratic pattern. The court also had innumerable instances to see how the core values of the constitution could need to be upheld. For instance, in S.R. Bommey case, where the court discussed federalism at length, secularism at length, to suggest that these are the core features of the constitution and these are essential for a vibrant democracy to exist. The court had it first came across with the case in ADM Jabalpur case about the detention cases during the emergency. There were a number of high courts which upheld, which have actually struck down the order of the president, but the same was upheld by the Supreme Court, and some suggest that the Supreme Court lost an opportunity to protect the individual, the civil liberties of the people. To a large extent, this was rectified in Maneka Gandhi case in 1978. And in this 1978 case, though it was an issue relating to impounding of passport, the court expanded the interpretation of Article 21 to suggest that because of the particular government order, if the direct and inevitable effect of that order is leading to curtailment of a set of rights guaranteed by the life and liberty clause in Article 21, then it has to go through the procedure established by law clause in the same article, thereby bringing into force the due process of law, which was otherwise not directly covered within the constitutional provision, and the constitution makers have deliberately avoided it. There were opportunities to test the due process clause even in A.K. Gopalan case, but then in 1978 the court brought it into the constitution through this judgment of Maneka Gandhi. In the post-emergency phase, the Supreme Court had ensured that a number of core civil liberties of the people, including prisoners and under trials, needs to be safeguarded, and an active intervention from the court is necessary to safeguard those liberties. At the same time, one could also come across certain judgments which may not have been very appealing. For instance, the Shah Banu case, while the court was able to uphold the rights of the woman, Muslim woman, to get maintenance under section 125 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, and therefore, to that extent the Muslim women are not exempted from the general laws of the land in terms of applicability of those provisions. The Parliament intervened and then brought in the necessary legislation in 1986 to overcome the effect of Shah Banu case. So, to that extent one can see that the judiciary in democratic societies, I said, exercises the power of judicial review and therefore have a check on the executive and legislative actions. If the Shah Banu case is taken into account, one can see that the Parliament has enacted the law in order to overcome the effect of the Shah Banu judgment. Similarly, one can see that one of the very cases in which the democratic traditions were questioned was in the dissolution case, that is state of Rajasthan case of 1977, where a number of state governments were to be going through the president's rule, and the challenge had come before the court. The court did not actually use that opportunity to see that there was any malified intention on the part of the behind that presidential order. Now, it could also be seen that there were a number of cases coming up again and again in the court in terms of the corrupt practices during election, the need for free and fair elections as essential component of democracy. Even recently, there were instances to suggest that there were certain practices of the political parties or the ruling government in terms of providing huge advertisement, spending public money, needs to be accounted for. What the Supreme Court said recently was that we need to have to develop guidelines to see how these advertisements are given by the government. On the one hand, the government advertisements are necessary for imparting information about their activities and creating awareness among the public, but on the other hand, it should not be a pretext of those political parties who are ruling the government at that time in order to see that they will not have an unfavorable gains during election campaign. It also needs to be seen how black money issues crop up and how the court tackle those issues in the while the disputes come before the court. One could also see that there are certain speeches delivered by political parties which gave an opportunity to the court to be scrutinized whether that could be permitted in the name of free speech. But the court, instead of looking at that issue, the court said there are ideal institutions designated by the constitution and which has initiated the process of inquiry, for instance the election commission, into the activities of those political parties in terms of hate speech, and to that extent the court restrained itself from having a decision delivered on it. But anyway, there are a number of judgments by the court to suggest that free and fair elections will only be the mechanism to ensure a vibrant democracy. Now, an area where one feels problematic relationship between the court and the rights of the people is in the field of terrorism. How does one define terrorism? How does one define threat to national security? All these are contested issues on which still arguments are being developed both in favor and against the judicial process. Now, judiciary is having the duty to safeguard the human rights, but should it be safeguarding the human rights of the civilians, or is it also expected of the judiciary to safeguard the human rights of the so-called terrorists? How does the judiciary strike a right balance while safeguarding the human rights of both? And what role is envisaged for the state, for instance in countries like India, which is based on a democratic form of government? To what extent the state could safeguard the rights of both groups, both those who are alleged to have terrorist links and those who are the ordinary civilians. So, as a whole, judiciary has a proactive role in ensuring democratic form of government, and in countries like India this is ensured through the constitutional provisions, but it all depends upon how the judiciary needs to have introspection of itself. Many of the judges who constitute part of the decision making while adjudicating on constitutional issues would also reflect their own ideologies, their own preferences. So, to a large extent the judicial process upholding democracy is also being to an extent dictated by the ideologies and the concerns of the judges who constitute the team delivering the judgment. But there were instances, ample opportunities in countries like India to show that judiciary has performed a crucial role in safeguarding democracy. There are law times where the judiciary may not have performed to that extent, but it took up time again to see that those democratic norms are brought back and given due dignified place in the governance of the country. Thank you.